Hello everyone, I am Mr. Midnight. I know many of you enjoy listening to these videos as you fall asleep. So before you drift off, I'd love for you to leave a comment letting me know where in the world you're tuning in from. And if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and subscribe. All right, now let's get comfortable, relax, and dive into tonight's case. Story 1. On a warm June morning in 2023, the quiet stillness of a Cleveland neighborhood was broken by a call no dispatcher ever wants to receive. A young woman's voice, strained and uneven, told the operator that her baby was not breathing. When first responders arrived at the modest apartment, they were met not with chaos but with silence. Inside a small playpen wrapped in soiled bedding lay the body of a 16-month-old girl named Jalen Candelario. She was lifeless, severely emaciated, her body showing unmistakable signs of prolonged neglect. The apartment itself was eerily calm, untouched by struggle, absent of any indication that another human had been present in days. What investigators would soon uncover would shock even the most seasoned professionals and force the nation to confront one of the most disturbing cases of child neglect in modern American history. Crystal Candelario was 32 years old at the time. To those who knew her casually, she appeared unremarkable, quiet, often withdrawn, a single mother trying to navigate life on her own. She lived in a second-floor apartment in Cleveland, Ohio, raising her daughter without a partner and with limited support. Jalen was her only child. Friends and family later described Crystal as reserved, someone who kept her struggles private. She worked intermittently, relied on social assistance, and battled mental health challenges that she rarely discussed openly. On the surface, there was nothing to suggest that what would unfold behind the closed doors of her apartment would end in tragedy. Jalen had been born healthy. She was described as a calm toddler, small for her age but alert and expressive. She liked music, responded to familiar voices, and had just begun to explore the world with the unsteady curiosity of early childhood. Like many toddlers, she depended entirely on her caregiver for survival. Food, water, comfort, protection, all of it came from one source, her mother. In early June, Crystal made plans that would later become the central focus of the investigation. She arranged a vacation, not a short overnight trip or a brief absence. She planned to leave town for more than a week, first to Detroit, then onward to Puerto Rico. Travel records, social media activity, and phone data would later confirm that she left Cleveland on June 6, 2023. She did not arrange childcare. She did not notify family members. She did not leave Jalen with a friend, a neighbor, or a relative. Instead, she placed her 16-month-old daughter into a playpen, left food and bottles behind that would last only a short time, and locked the door. The timeline that investigators reconstructed was chilling in its clarity. For approximately 10 days, Jalen was alone. Inside the apartment, there was no electricity shutoff, no signs of intrusion, no external force at play. This was not an accident caused by disaster or emergency. It was deliberate abandonment. Jalen had no access to food beyond what was initially left, no access to water, no ability to escape. As hours turned into days, the toddler would have cried, then weakened, then fallen silent. Medical experts later explained that a child of her age would begin to suffer severe dehydration within 24 to 48 hours. Organ failure would follow. Starvation would compound the suffering. It was a slow death. While Jalen remained trapped in the apartment, Crystal traveled. Surveillance footage, credit card records, and cell phone location data placed her at hotels, restaurants, tourist locations. She posed for photos. She walked beaches. She visited casinos. She smiled. Prosecutors would later argue that this was not a momentary lapse in judgment, but a sustained period of conscious decision-making. Every day that passed, every meal consumed, every night spent away represented another opportunity to turn back. She did not. On June 16, Crystal returned to Cleveland. She entered the apartment and found her daughter unresponsive. It was then, and only then, that she called for help. When first responders arrived, they immediately recognized the severity of what they were seeing. Jalen's body showed extreme signs of dehydration. Her eyes were sunken, her limbs were frail. The playpen liner was soaked with waste. There was no evidence that anyone had checked on her in days. Emergency medical personnel pronounced her dead at the scene. Police officers who responded described the environment as hauntingly quiet. There were toys nearby, untouched. A child's world frozen in time. Crystal was taken into custody and transported for questioning. During initial interviews, she offered explanations that quickly unraveled under scrutiny. She suggested that Jalen had been refusing food, that she had been sick, but investigators already had evidence that contradicted those claims. Cell phone data placed Crystal hundreds of miles away. Surveillance confirmed her movements. There was no caregiver, no excuse. As the investigation deepened, the emotional weight of the case intensified. Detectives reviewed Crystal's travel itinerary. They analyzed photos and messages from her phone. In one image taken during the trip, Crystal appeared relaxed, smiling. Prosecutors would later describe this contrast as one of the most disturbing elements of the case, a mother enjoying leisure while her child slowly died alone. The medical examiner's findings were unequivocal. Jalen died from starvation and severe dehydration. This was classified as a homicide. The cause was neglect. The manner was intentional abandonment. Crystal Candelario was formally charged with aggravated murder, child endangerment, and multiple related counts. The severity of the charges reflected the prosecution's position that this was not mere negligence, but a conscious decision that resulted in a child's death. The court proceedings that followed would draw national attention. Public outrage grew rapidly. Many struggled to comprehend how such an act could occur without intervention. Questions emerged about missed warning signs, about social services, about isolation, and about mental health. Behind the headlines, however, was a much quieter reality. Jalen had no voice, no chance to escape, no understanding of why the person she trusted most never came back. As Crystal awaited trial, held without bond, the case moved forward methodically. Prosecutors prepared evidence that would outline the full scope of the abandonment. Defense attorneys began shaping a narrative centered on mental illness, depression, and impaired judgment. The stage was set for a courtroom battle that would force jurors and the public to confront uncomfortable questions about responsibility, accountability, and the limits of empathy. This was no longer just a story about a crime. It was a story about absence, about what happens when care is withdrawn completely, about a child who depended on one person, and what it meant when that person chose herself instead. And this was only the beginning. In the days following Jalen Candelario's death, investigators began the painstaking work of reconstructing not just a timeline, but a life. They weren't only trying to understand how a toddler had been left alone long enough to starve to death. They were trying to understand who Crystal Candelario was, how she had arrived at such a decision, and whether there had been moments, warning signs, interventions, cries for help, that could have prevented what ultimately happened inside that Cleveland apartment. Crystal's life had not followed an easy path. Born and raised in Ohio, she grew up in a family marked by instability. Relatives later described a childhood shaped by emotional distance and inconsistent support. Crystal struggled academically, often drifting between short-term jobs and periods of unemployment. As she entered adulthood, those struggles deepened. She battled depression, anxiety, and what some family members suspected were untreated mental health disorders. Yet despite these challenges, she functioned outwardly well enough to avoid sustained intervention. She paid rent. She showed up when required. She avoided drawing attention. When Jalen was born, Crystal's life narrowed almost entirely to her daughter. Friends recalled that she loved her child, spoke about her often, and appeared attentive during Jalen's early months. But motherhood also intensified Crystal's isolation. She had no co-parent. The baby's father was not involved. Financial stress increased. Sleepless nights compounded her mental health struggles. Over time, those closest to her noticed changes. Crystal became more withdrawn. She canceled plans. She stopped answering messages as frequently. Still, no one suspected the depth of her detachment. Social services would later become a focal point of public scrutiny. Records showed that Crystal had some prior contact with assistance programs, but there was no active case monitoring Jalen's welfare. No open child protective services investigation. No mandated home visits. Jalen, in the eyes of the system, was invisible. She was another child living quietly behind closed doors, dependent on a single caregiver who was slowly unraveling. As detectives examined Crystal's digital footprint, a stark contrast emerged between her internal world and her external behavior. In the weeks leading up to the trip, she searched online for vacation packages, flights, and hotels. She browsed entertainment venues. There were no searches about childcare, no inquiries about babysitters, no messages asking family members for help. Prosecutors would later argue that this absence was just as telling as any incriminating evidence. It suggested planning without consideration for the child left behind. Phone records revealed something else. During the days Jalen was alone, Crystal did not attempt to check in on her daughter in any way. There were no calls to neighbors, no texts asking someone to stop by, no signs of hesitation. Each day passed without intervention, reinforcing the prosecution's claim that this was a sustained, conscious abandonment rather than a moment of emotional collapse. The defense would later attempt to frame Crystal's actions through the lens of severe mental illness. They argued that she was experiencing dissociation, emotional detachment, and impaired judgment, symptoms consistent with untreated depression and possible personality disorders. They suggested that Crystal compartmentalized her responsibilities, mentally separating herself from the reality of her child's dependence. But prosecutors pushed back hard against this narrative. They emphasized that mental illness does not erase intent, especially when actions require planning, coordination, and repeated choices over an extended period. The apartment itself told a story that words could not. Crime scene photographs showed the playpen positioned near a wall, away from windows. Inside were empty bottles, dried food remnants, and bedding heavily soiled over time. There was no evidence of a sudden medical emergency, no indication that Jalen had passed quickly or peacefully. Experts explained that the physical findings suggested prolonged suffering. The child had likely cried until she no longer had the strength to do so. When the autopsy report was released, it confirmed the worst fears. Jalen weighed significantly less than expected for her age. Her organs showed signs of severe dehydration. There was no underlying illness that could explain her condition. The cause of death was starvation and dehydration due to neglect. The manner of death was ruled homicide. Public reaction was swift and intense. News outlets across the country covered the case. Headlines focused on the brutality of neglect rather than violence, a reminder that harm does not always come from a weapon. Vigils were held. Stuffed animals, flowers, and candles appeared outside the apartment building. People who had never met Jalen mourned her, struggling to understand how such suffering could occur unnoticed. As Crystal sat in jail awaiting trial, she began to speak more openly with her attorneys. She expressed remorse, though prosecutors later argued that remorse after the fact did nothing to undo the calculated nature of her actions. She reportedly told mental health evaluators that she felt overwhelmed, that she needed a break, that she believed Jalen would be okay. That statement, simple and devastating, became a central point of contention. A belief that had no basis in reality had cost a child her life. The court ordered a comprehensive psychological evaluation to determine Crystal's competency and mental state at the time of the crime. Experts assessed her cognitive functioning, emotional regulation, and ability to understand right from wrong. The findings would play a crucial role in determining whether the case would go to trial or end in a plea. Meanwhile, prosecutors prepared for what they viewed as a straightforward argument. This was not a crime of passion, not an accident, not a single bad decision made in a moment of crisis. It was 10 days of absence, 10 days of silence, 10 days during which a child depended entirely on someone who chose not to return. Jalen's story began to symbolize something larger. A failure not just of one mother, but of isolation, untreated mental illness, and a system that often reacts only after tragedy strikes. Yet in the courtroom, symbolism would matter far less than facts, and the facts were grim. As the trial date approached, one question loomed over everything. How would justice measure a crime defined not by violence, but by absence? By the time Crystal Candelario was brought into the courtroom, the case against her was already overwhelming. There were no mysteries left about what had happened inside the Cleveland apartment. The unanswered questions were no longer about how Jalen died, but about how the justice system would respond to a crime defined by prolonged neglect rather than sudden violence. Crystal appeared physically small as she entered court, her posture closed, her eyes often fixed on the floor. Observers noted that she rarely looked toward the gallery, where members of the public and media filled the benches. There were no family members advocating on her behalf, no visible support system standing behind her. That absence mirrored the isolation that had characterized her life long before Jalen's death. The prosecution's case rested on a simple, devastating truth. Jalen had been entirely dependent on her mother, and her mother had knowingly left her alone. Assistant prosecutors walked the court through a detailed timeline, reconstructing Crystal's movements from the moment she locked the apartment door to the day she returned. Surveillance footage, airline records, phone location data, and transaction logs created a continuous narrative of freedom and leisure unfolding simultaneously with a child's slow death. They emphasized that this was not a single lapse in judgment. Crystal had multiple opportunities to turn back. She could have shortened her trip. She could have asked someone to check on Jalen. She could have returned early when days passed without intervention. Instead, the prosecution argued, she chose inaction again and again. Expert witnesses were called to explain what starvation and dehydration look like in a toddler. Pediatric specialists described how quickly a young child deteriorates without food and water, how confusion, weakness, and organ failure set in, and how distress escalates before the body finally gives out. These testimonies were clinical, factual, and deeply unsettling. Several people in the courtroom reportedly looked away, unable to reconcile the sterile language of medicine with the reality it described. The autopsy findings were presented carefully, but with unmistakable clarity. Jalen had not died quickly. She had suffered. There was no evidence of illness, injury, or external interference. Her death was the direct result of being left alone without care. When the defense began its case, it took a markedly different approach. Crystal's attorneys did not deny the physical facts. They did not attempt to dispute the timeline. Instead, they focused entirely on Crystal's mental state. Their argument was that while her actions were indefensible, They were the result of severe mental illness that impaired her ability to comprehend the consequences of her behavior. Mental health experts testified about Crystal's history of depression, emotional detachment, and possible dissociative symptoms. They described a woman who struggled with reality under stress, who compartmentalized responsibilities, and who may have entered a psychological state where the needs of her child felt distant or abstract. According to this view, Crystal did not fully grasp the inevitability of what would happen to Jalen in her absence. Prosecutors countered this argument forcefully. They pointed out that Crystal had demonstrated clear executive functioning throughout the trip. She booked flights. She navigated airports. She attended events. She communicated with others. She made decisions daily that required awareness, planning, and follow-through. Mental illness, they argued, did not prevent her from understanding cause and effect. It did not prevent her from knowing that a toddler cannot survive alone. One of the most powerful moments of the trial came when the prosecution addressed the idea of intent. They explained that intent does not always mean wanting a specific outcome. Sometimes, intent is knowingly creating conditions where a harmful outcome is inevitable. By leaving Jalen alone for 10 days, Crystal had created such conditions. As the trial progressed, public attention intensified. News coverage was relentless. Commentators debated whether this case should be seen primarily as a criminal act or as a mental health tragedy. Online discussions grew heated, with some calling for the harshest possible punishment, and others arguing that Crystal herself was a broken person who needed treatment rather than condemnation. Inside the courtroom, however, the law allowed little room for ambiguity. The charge Crystal faced was aggravated murder, a count reserved for cases involving extreme neglect or cruelty. The potential sentence was life in prison without the possibility of parole. As closing arguments approached, Crystal made a decision that would bring the trial to an abrupt end. On the advice of her attorneys, she chose to enter a guilty plea. The plea spared the court from a jury verdict, but it did not lessen the gravity of what was to come. When Crystal stood before the judge and formally admitted responsibility, her voice was barely audible. She acknowledged that she had left her daughter alone, knowing no one would care for her. The courtroom was silent as the weight of that admission settled in. The plea agreement removed the uncertainty of trial, but ensured that Crystal would face the maximum consequences under the law. There would be no chance of early release, no parole hearings decades later. The sentence would reflect the court's determination that this crime represented an irreversible breach of parental duty. Before sentencing, the judge allowed statements from the prosecution and the defense. The prosecution spoke not of vengeance, but of accountability. They described Jalen as a child who had trusted completely and been abandoned utterly. The defense asked the court to consider Crystal's mental illness and lifelong struggles, urging compassion even in punishment. Crystal was given the opportunity to speak. She apologized. She said she loved her daughter. She said she wished she could change what she had done. But apologies, spoken after the fact, could not change the outcome. Jalen was gone. The sentencing hearing took place in a courtroom heavy with silence. There was no family seated behind Crystal Candelario, no one to speak on her behalf beyond her attorneys. Jalen Candelario, the child at the center of the case, had no voice of her own, and no relative stepped forward to deliver a victim impact statement. That absence, more than anything else, underscored the profound isolation that had defined both lives long before the crime itself. The judge began by reciting the facts of the case one final time. The words were measured, deliberate, and unflinching. A toddler left alone for 10 days. No food, no water, no human contact. The judge emphasized that this was not an accident or a momentary lapse. It was a sustained act of neglect that resulted in prolonged suffering and death. The court acknowledged Crystal's mental health struggles, but made clear that they did not excuse her actions. In imposing the sentence, the judge stated that society places its highest duty on those who care for children. When that duty is violated in such an extreme and irreversible way, the law must respond with its strongest condemnation. Crystal Candelario was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The sentence was final. There would be no future hearings to reconsider her release. No opportunity decades later to argue rehabilitation. The punishment reflected the court's conclusion that Crystal had forfeited her place in society by abandoning the most basic responsibility entrusted to her. Crystal showed little outward reaction as the sentence was read. She stood still, her expression unreadable, as deputies prepared to escort her from the courtroom. For many observers, the lack of visible emotion was unsettling. For others, it seemed consistent with a woman who had long been emotionally detached from the world around her. Public reaction to the sentence was swift and polarized. Many expressed relief that the court had imposed the harshest possible penalty. They viewed life without parole as the only appropriate response to a crime involving such prolonged suffering of a defenseless child. Others questioned whether the sentence addressed the deeper issues the case exposed. Mental health advocates argued that Crystal's untreated psychological condition was a contributing factor that society had failed to address in time. The case reignited national conversations about parental responsibility, mental health support, and the limitations of child welfare systems. How could a toddler disappear into neglect without anyone noticing? How many families live in similar isolation, one crisis away from tragedy? Critics pointed out that systems designed to protect children often rely on visible warning signs, while neglect behind closed doors can go undetected until it is too late. Jalen Candelario's death became a symbol of that failure. Vigils continued long after the trial ended. Community members placed memorials outside the apartment complex where she had died. Children's toys, handwritten notes, and photographs appeared, left by strangers who felt compelled to acknowledge a life that had ended without care or comfort. In response to public outrage, local officials and advocacy groups pushed for reforms. Proposals included increased wellness checks for families receiving assistance, expanded mental health outreach for single parents, and stronger community-based support networks to identify isolation before it becomes fatal. While no single reform could undo what happened to Jalen, many hoped that awareness might prevent similar tragedies in the future. For Crystal, life moved into the rigid structure of the prison system. Evaluations continued, and she was placed under mental health supervision within the facility. But treatment came too late to matter for her daughter. Her days would now be defined by routine and confinement, a stark contrast to the freedom she had chosen over responsibility. Jalen's story did not end with the closing of the courtroom doors. It lives on in every discussion about neglect that does not involve bruises or blood, but causes harm just as deadly. It serves as a reminder that violence can be passive, that absence can kill, and that the failure to act can be as destructive as deliberate cruelty. In the end, the case of Crystal Candelario is not only about a mother who abandoned her child. It is about the fragile line between personal struggle and criminal responsibility. It is about the danger of isolation, the consequences of untreated mental illness, and the unforgiving reality that children cannot survive without care. Most of all, it is about Jalen, a little girl who depended completely on someone who chose to walk away. A life defined not by how it ended, but by the fact that it should never have ended at all. Her name remains, a quiet indictment of a tragedy that should never be repeated. Story 2. On a humid August morning in 2018, the city of Delhi woke up to a discovery so disturbing that it would shake the entire nation. Inside a modest two-story house in the quiet neighborhood of Burari, 11 members of the same family were found dead. 10 of them were hanging from the ceiling in the main hallway, blindfolded, mouths taped shut, ears plugged with cotton. The 11th, the family's elderly matriarch, lay strangled in another room. There were no signs of forced entry, no struggle, no chaos. Instead, the scene looked eerily organized, almost ritualistic. What initially appeared to be a mass murder would soon unravel into one of the most complex and psychologically unsettling cases in Indian criminal history. It was not driven by greed, revenge, or rage. It was driven by belief, by obedience, by a shared delusion that turned an ordinary family into participants in their own destruction. This is the story of the Chundawat family. The Chundawats were not reclusive or strange in any obvious way. They were well known in Burari. Neighbors described them as polite, religious, and deeply family-oriented. The family patriarch, Lalit Chundawat, ran a grocery store on the ground floor of their home, a business that had served the community for years. His brothers and sisters lived together under the same roof, along with their parents and children. It was a traditional Indian joint family, the kind often idealized for its closeness and shared values. At the center of this family was Narayani Devi, the 77-year-old grandmother. She was considered the moral anchor of the household, deeply religious and respected by everyone. Though physically frail, she held emotional authority. Family members often sought her blessings before important decisions. Her death would later be ruled as strangulation, setting her apart from the others in a way that would raise chilling questions. The day before the bodies were discovered, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. The grocery store had opened and closed as usual. Children went about their routines. Neighbors saw family members entering and leaving the house. There were no arguments reported, no signs of distress. Life appeared normal. Then, on the morning of August 1st, 2018, a neighbor noticed something strange. The Chundawat grocery store had not opened at its usual time. Repeated knocks went unanswered. Concerned, neighbors contacted the police. When officers forced their way inside the home, they were confronted with a sight that even seasoned investigators struggled to process. Bodies hung from the ceiling in a straight line. Each person was suspended at a similar height, feet touching the ground. Their hands were tied behind their backs. Blindfolds covered their eyes. Cotton stuffed their ears. Tape sealed their mouths. It looked coordinated, deliberate, almost ceremonial. There was no sign of panic or resistance. Plates of food were found prepared in the kitchen, suggesting that the family had eaten together before their deaths. The immediate assumption was murder, but who could have done this? There were no broken locks, no weapons scattered around, no blood splatter, and most unsettling of all, nothing appeared to be missing. This wasn't robbery. This wasn't a crime of opportunity. As police expanded their search of the house, they made a discovery that would completely change the direction of the investigation. In a cupboard, they found a stack of handwritten notebooks. 11 notebooks, filled with meticulous instructions written over a period of nearly a decade. The entries detailed rituals, schedules, prayers, and precise directions for behavior. Some instructions were mundane, others were deeply alarming. One passage described how family members should tie their hands and blindfold themselves. Another explained that hanging in a specific manner would not result in death, but spiritual liberation. The writings claimed that divine forces would intervene at the final moment, saving the family and blessing them with prosperity and peace. The handwriting belonged to Lalit Chundawat. As investigators pieced together Lalit's history, a troubling picture emerged. Years earlier, Lalit had survived a traumatic accident that left him physically and psychologically altered. Family members claimed that after the accident, Lalit began experiencing episodes where he spoke in the voice of his deceased father. The family came to believe that Lalit was being guided by his father's spirit, offering wisdom and instructions to protect and elevate the family. Over time, these episodes became central to family life. Lalit's instructions were no longer questioned. They were written down, followed carefully, and passed off as divine guidance. What began as faith slowly transformed into control. The notebooks revealed a gradual escalation. Early entries focused on prayer and discipline. Later ones introduced punishment for disobedience. Eventually, they outlined the final ritual that promised salvation for the entire family. Police now faced a disturbing possibility. This was not a crime committed by an outsider. This was not even a conventional murder-suicide. This was something far more unsettling, a case of shared psychosis, where an entire family surrendered its autonomy to a belief system that led them willingly toward death. As news spread, India watched in disbelief. Television debates erupted. Psychologists, religious leaders, and law enforcement officials struggled to explain how such a tragedy could occur in plain sight. How could educated adults, caring parents, and devoted siblings follow instructions that led to their own deaths? The answer, investigators realized, lay not in a single moment but in years of unquestioned belief, emotional dependence, and fear of disobedience. And as the notebooks were read line by line, it became clear that what happened in the Burari house was not spontaneous. It was planned, it was practiced, and it was believed. As investigators continued to study the notebooks recovered from the Burari house, a disturbing rhythm began to emerge. The writings were not chaotic or erratic. They were structured, methodical, and deeply repetitive. Dates were marked. Instructions were refined over time. Corrections were added in the margins, as if the author were perfecting a process. This was not the work of a single night of madness. It was the documentation of a belief system that had slowly taken over an entire family. The earliest notebooks focused on spiritual discipline. They spoke of waking before dawn, bathing at specific times, reciting mantras in a fixed order, and maintaining strict obedience within the household. Lalit, believed by the family to be channeling his deceased father, was positioned as the medium through which divine guidance flowed. What he said was not treated as opinion. It was treated as instruction. Family members were expected to follow without question. At first, these practices appeared harmless. Many Indian households followed daily rituals and prayers. Neighbors noticed nothing unusual. The family attended weddings, ran businesses, and participated in community life. Outwardly, the Chundawats looked stable and functional. Inwardly, however, something subtle but dangerous was taking shape. Psychologists later explained that the family dynamic had slowly shifted into a hierarchy of unquestioned authority. Lalit's visions gave him power. Narayani Devi's religious devotion reinforced it. Together, belief and obedience created an environment where dissent felt not just wrong but dangerous. According to the notebooks, disobedience would anger the divine. Anger would invite misfortune. Misfortune would harm the family. Fear, disguised as faith, became the glue holding the system together. One particularly chilling aspect of the writings was the way suffering was reframed. Pain was not something to be avoided. It was something to be endured. Silence was praised. Blindfolds were described as a way to shut out worldly distractions. Cotton in the ears symbolized detachment from external negativity. Binding the hands represented surrender. None of this was written as violence. It was written as purification. The notebooks also suggested that the family rehearsed parts of the ritual. Instructions mentioned practice days, where members would tie their hands loosely or cover their eyes for short periods. These rehearsals normalized restraint. They reduced fear. They made the final act feel familiar. Investigators believe this gradual conditioning was crucial. By the time the final ritual was proposed, the family had already accepted physical restriction as spiritual discipline. Hanging, described as a temporary suspension, was framed as the last step before divine intervention. The notebooks repeatedly insisted on one key promise: no one would die. The family believed that at the critical moment their ancestors would appear. The ropes would loosen. Blessings would follow. Wealth, harmony, and protection would be granted to future generations. Death was never acknowledged as a possible outcome. In the belief system created within those pages, death simply did not exist. This is where shared psychosis became fatal. Psychiatrists later described the case as a classic example of polyaphamia, a rare condition where delusional beliefs are transmitted within a close-knit group. Lalit, believed to be the primary source of the delusion, was surrounded by individuals emotionally dependent on him. Questioning him meant questioning the voice of their father. Questioning the voice meant risking divine punishment. No one wanted to be the one who broke the chain. What made the tragedy even more unsettling was the involvement of children. Teenagers and young adults followed the instructions alongside their parents. They trusted the adults. They trusted the structure of the family. They trusted that obedience would keep them safe. Police found school bags neatly packed, uniforms laid out, alarm clocks set. Life in their minds was going to continue. As forensic teams examined the bodies, they found no defensive wounds, no signs of struggle. The knots were tied with care, not desperation. Most of the family members were standing on stools or platforms, suggesting coordination and assistance. This was not chaos. This was compliance. The elderly matriarch's death raised troubling questions. Narayani Devi had not been hanging. She had been strangled. Some investigators theorized that she may not have been physically capable of standing for the ritual. Others believed she may have resisted at the final moment. The notebooks, however, offered no clear explanation for her death. Her presence or absence from the ritual marked a subtle fracture in the narrative of unity the family believed in. As the investigation unfolded, media scrutiny intensified. The public struggled to reconcile the idea that faith could lead to such destruction. Religious leaders distanced themselves, emphasizing that no legitimate belief system condoned harm. Psychologists warned about the dangers of blind obedience and unchecked authority within families. The Burari house became a symbol of how isolation does not always look like loneliness. Sometimes, it looks like closeness taken too far. In the days following the discovery, extended family members expressed shock. They had noticed Lalit's changes over the years but never imagined they would lead to this. Some admitted that questioning him felt impossible. Others said they believed the rituals were harmless. Everyone assumed someone else would intervene. No one did. And by the time reality confronted belief, there was no one left to save. The final hours inside the Burari house were not marked by panic or chaos. They were quiet, structured, almost eerily calm. Investigators would later reconstruct the timeline using CCTV footage from nearby streets, phone records, and the instructions written in the notebooks. What they found was not a sudden breakdown, but the completion of a long-planned ritual that the family believed would save them. On the evening of July 31st, 2018, the Chundawat family gathered for dinner as they often did. There was nothing outwardly unusual about the meal. Plates were prepared. Food was cooked and served. Neighbors reported seeing family members moving normally throughout the day. Some even exchanged greetings. No one appeared distressed. No one appeared afraid. This normalcy was part of what made the case so disturbing. There was no visible warning sign that the family was hours away from collective death. According to the notebooks, the ritual was meant to take place at night after prayers, when the house was quiet and undisturbed. Instructions emphasized unity, silence, and trust. The family was to move together, follow each step carefully, and avoid speaking once the ritual began. Phones were switched off. Lights were adjusted. Curtains were drawn. Inside the narrow hallway where the bodies would later be found, iron mesh grills had already been installed on the ceiling. Ropes were prepared. Stools and platforms were arranged in a line. This had not been done in haste. It had been planned in advance. Investigators believe Lalit guided the family through the final steps. Whether he spoke aloud or communicated through gestures remains unknown, but his authority was unquestioned. Each person took their place. Blindfolds were tied. Cotton was placed in ears. Mouths were taped shut. Hands were bound behind backs. These acts, which might seem impossible to accept voluntarily, were reframed in the family's belief system as acts of surrender. The notebooks described them as symbolic gestures meant to demonstrate faith. To refuse would mean doubt. To doubt would mean failure. One by one, the family members climbed onto stools beneath the hanging ropes. The instructions specified that the feet should remain close to the ground. This detail reinforced the belief that death was not the outcome. They were not hanging in the conventional sense. They were suspending themselves temporarily. The notebooks promised that at the final moment, divine intervention would occur. It never did. As the family's weight shifted forward, pressure built around their necks. Loss of consciousness would have followed within minutes. Medical experts later stated that hypoxia, caused by compression of blood vessels rather than full hanging, would have been enough to kill them. There was no one left to intervene. The house fell silent. By the time morning came, the ritual had ended not in salvation, but in irreversible loss. When police entered the house hours later, the stillness was overwhelming. The scene felt frozen in time. Investigators described the overwhelming sense that what they were witnessing was not a crime scene in the traditional sense, but the aftermath of belief gone unchecked. As the case moved from investigation to public discourse, the question shifted from how this happened to why no one stopped it. Experts began examining the family's social structure. Despite living in a densely populated neighborhood, the Chundawats were emotionally isolated. Their strongest bonds existed within the household. External opinions were viewed with suspicion. Internal authority was absolute. This isolation was not physical. It was psychological. Relatives later admitted they noticed changes. Lalit's increasing influence, the family's rigid routines, their reluctance to discuss certain topics, but none of it seemed alarming enough to warrant intervention. After all, many families follow religious practices. Many households have strong leaders. The difference here was subtle but deadly. No one challenged the narrative. The notebooks became the most crucial evidence in understanding the tragedy. They revealed how belief had gradually overridden instinct. How fear of divine punishment outweighed fear of death. How love and loyalty were weaponized to ensure obedience. Perhaps the most haunting detail was that the notebooks ended abruptly. There was no final entry acknowledging death, no farewell, no expression of doubt. The last instructions simply ended. As if the writer truly believed there would be more pages to come. The nation struggled to process the implications. This was not a story of evil intent. It was a story of misplaced trust, of how authority, when wrapped in spirituality and reinforced by fear, can dismantle reason without anyone noticing until it is too late. The Burari deaths forced difficult conversations about mental health, religious extremism, and the danger of unquestioned obedience within families. Psychologists emphasize the importance of recognizing early warning signs, rigid belief systems, fear-based discipline, isolation from external viewpoints, and the elevation of one individual's authority above all others. Yet even with these insights, one question lingered. If belief can be strong enough to override survival instinct, how many similar situations go unnoticed? The house in Burari was eventually sealed. The family's grocery store closed. Life in the neighborhood slowly returned to normal. But the memory of what happened never truly faded, because what occurred inside that home was not an act of violence imposed from outside. It was an act of belief accepted from within. In the weeks following the discovery of the 11 bodies in the Burari house, the case moved from a criminal investigation into something far more complex and unsettling. With no surviving suspects and no evidence of external involvement, law enforcement officials were forced to confront a reality that felt deeply uncomfortable. There would be no arrests, no courtroom confessions, no conventional justice. The tragedy had already consumed everyone involved. Police officially ruled out murder by an outsider. The lack of forced entry, the uniform positioning of the bodies, and the detailed instructions found in the notebooks pointed toward a collective act driven by belief rather than coercion. The case was classified as a mass suicide, though even that label felt insufficient. It failed to capture the psychological manipulation, the shared delusion, and the gradual erosion of free will that had led the family to their deaths. Forensic experts confirmed that 10 of the family members died due to hanging, while Narayani Devi, the grandmother, died of strangulation. The reason for this difference was never conclusively determined. Some investigators believed she may have been unable to physically participate in the ritual. Others suggested she may have panicked or resisted at the last moment. The truth died with her. The notebooks were returned to the family after investigation, but their contents were widely reported. Psychiatrists and criminologists pored over them, identifying classic markers of shared psychosis. Lalit Chundawat was believed to be the primary source of the delusional system. His trauma, combined with unresolved grief and the family's deep reverence for paternal authority, created a psychological environment where his visions went unchallenged. Yet Lalit alone was not the cause. Experts emphasize that shared delusions require receptive minds. The family's emotional dependence on one another, their isolation from external perspectives, and their deep-rooted fear of divine punishment all played crucial roles. Over time, belief hardened into certainty. Obedience replaced reasoning. Doubt became unthinkable. In many ways, the Burari case forced India to confront uncomfortable questions about the intersection of faith and mental health. Religious practices are deeply woven into Indian society, often passed down through generations. The line between devotion and delusion can sometimes blur, especially when spiritual authority goes unchecked. Mental health professionals use the case to highlight the dangers of stigmatizing psychological illness. Lalit's symptoms were never treated as a medical concern. They were interpreted as spiritual experiences. Had they been examined earlier through a clinical lens, intervention might have been possible. The tragedy also exposed how easily warning signs can be normalized. Strict routines, fear-based discipline, absolute obedience, emotional isolation. None of these behaviors triggered alarm on their own. Together, they formed a system that quietly dismantled autonomy. Public reaction was intense. The Burari house became a place of morbid fascination. Crowds gathered. Media vans lined the streets. Neighbors struggled with guilt, wondering if they should have noticed more. Extended family members faced scrutiny and grief in equal measure. Eventually, authorities sealed the house. The grocery store never reopened. The family name, once respected, became synonymous with one of the most disturbing cases in modern Indian history. Over time, discussions around the case shifted. It stopped being about what happened and became about what it revealed, about how belief can override instinct, about how authority can silence doubt, about how love and loyalty, when fused with fear, can become tools of destruction. The Burari deaths were not the result of hatred or violence in the traditional sense. There was no enemy, no villain in the shadows. The danger came from within the family itself, nurtured by unquestioned faith and reinforced by silence. Perhaps the most haunting aspect of the case is how ordinary the family appeared. They were not extremists living on the fringes of society. They were shopkeepers, parents, students, neighbors. Their story serves as a reminder that tragedy does not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it unfolds quietly, hidden behind routine and ritual. Today, the Burari case is studied in psychology courses, criminology discussions, and mental health forums. It stands as a cautionary tale about the importance of critical thinking, open dialogue, and mental health awareness. It urges families to question without fear, to seek help without shame, to recognize that faith, when it demands silence and surrender, can become dangerous. The house in Burari may be empty now, but the questions it raised remain. How many beliefs go unchallenged because questioning feels like betrayal? How many warning signs are ignored because they look like tradition? How many tragedies could be prevented if doubt were allowed to exist? There are no easy answers, only the quiet understanding that belief, when left unchecked, can be as powerful as any weapon. And in Burari, belief proved deadly. Story 3. Los Angeles, California, a city built on reinvention, a place where millions arrive chasing second chances, brighter futures, and the promise that whatever came before can be left behind. In this city, anonymity is easy to find, and sometimes it's in that anonymity where the darkest stories take root. On a warm August morning, just after sunrise, a maintenance worker unlocked the side entrance of a mid-rise apartment complex in Koreatown. The building wasn't glamorous, but it was desirable enough, close to transit, affordable by LA standards, filled with young professionals, immigrants, and families trying to make a life in one of the most expensive cities in America. The worker had one job that morning: check a reported water leak on the fourth floor. What he found instead would become one of the most disturbing cases Los Angeles had seen in years. The hallway was quiet, unnaturally so. The smell hit first. Not sharp, not immediate, something heavy and wrong lingering in the air. It seemed to be coming from apartment 4D. A dark stain had begun to seep beneath the door, spreading slowly across the beige carpet. He knocked once. No answer. He knocked again, louder this time. Still nothing. Following protocol, he used the master key. The door opened only a few inches before resistance stopped it. Something was blocking it from the inside. He pushed harder. The door gave way just enough for him to see inside. He stepped back instantly, heart racing, stomach turning. Inside the apartment were 3 bodies. A woman lay slumped against the couch, her head tilted at an unnatural angle. A man was sprawled face down near the kitchen, one arm extended as if he'd tried to crawl away. In the bedroom doorway, barely visible from the hall, was the small body of a child. The maintenance worker ran. By 7:18 a.m., Los Angeles Police Department officers had sealed off the entire floor. Yellow tape cut through the apartment complex like a wound. Residents were evacuated, confused and frightened, watching as forensic teams carried equipment upstairs. Word spread quickly. By noon, helicopters circled overhead. News vans lined the street. Social media filled with speculation before police had even confirmed the identities of the victims. Inside apartment 4D, detectives began the slow, meticulous process of documenting what appeared to be a family annihilation. There were no signs of forced entry, no sign of a struggle in the hallway, no immediate indication of an intruder. The apartment was tidy, too tidy. The victims were soon identified as 34-year-old Daniel Reyes, his wife, 32-year-old Marisol Reyes, and their 6-year-old daughter, Sophia. On paper, they looked like a success story. Daniel worked in logistics for a regional shipping company. Marisol was a freelance graphic designer who worked from home while caring for Sophia. They had moved to Los Angeles from San Bernardino County 5 years earlier, chasing better opportunities, better schools, and a better life. Neighbors described them as quiet, polite, private. They kept to themselves, one resident said. But they were nice, always said hello. Others remembered hearing arguments late at night, raised voices muffled by walls, nothing violent, nothing that felt worth calling the police over. In Los Angeles, noise travels. People learn to tune it out. Detectives moved through the apartment carefully. There were no weapons immediately visible, no overturned furniture, no broken glass. In the kitchen, a pot sat cold on the stove, half filled with rice. In the sink, 3 plates had been rinsed and stacked neatly. A family dinner interrupted. In the living room, Sophia's backpack leaned against the wall, packed for school. Inside, officers found a permission slip signed just 2 days earlier. She was supposed to start first grade that week. In the bedroom, Marisol's phone lay face down on the nightstand. Daniel's phone was missing. The medical examiner arrived shortly after noon. Preliminary observations suggested the deaths had occurred at least 36 hours earlier. Rigor mortis had passed. Livor mortis patterns indicated the bodies had not been moved. The child, Sophia, had been strangled. Marisol had suffered blunt force trauma to the head. Daniel had died from a gunshot wound. The gun was found beneath the kitchen sink, wiped clean. Detectives exchanged glances. This wasn't random. This wasn't a burglary. This was something deeply personal. By mid-afternoon, LAPD held a press conference. They confirmed the deaths and stated there was no ongoing threat to the public. The investigation, they said, was in its early stages. Behind the scenes, however, a theory was already forming: family annihilation. The question was not whether this was a murder-suicide. The question was why. As detectives dug into Daniel Ray's background, cracks in the picture of the normal family began to appear. Financial records revealed mounting debt, credit cards maxed out, payday loans taken out in quick succession. Rent payments had been late 3 times in the past year. Daniel's employer confirmed he had been placed on probation just 2 weeks earlier after a series of errors that cost the company thousands. Marisol's freelance work had slowed dramatically. Clients had dried up. She had confided to a friend that she felt trapped, financially dependent, emotionally isolated, and increasingly afraid of her husband's mood swings. Text messages recovered from her phone told a story she never shared publicly. "I don't recognize him anymore. He scares me when he gets quiet. I'm trying to keep things normal for Sophia." There were also messages that went unsent, drafts saved but never delivered. "I think I need help." Daniel's phone was eventually located in a trash bin 3 blocks from the apartment. It had been powered off, its screen shattered, but cloud backups told investigators what they needed to know. In the weeks leading up to the murders, Daniel had searched for phrases like life insurance, suicide clause, California, best way to make family death painless, family won't survive without me, debt forgiveness after death. Behavioral analysts recognized the language immediately. This was not panic, it was planning. As night fell over Los Angeles, candles appeared outside the apartment complex. Strangers gathered, holding signs with Sophia's name written in marker. A small stuffed bear was placed near the entrance, its fur already damp with melting wax. Inside the lapped offices downtown, detectives prepared for what they knew would be a long investigation. Because cases like this are never just about what happened. They are about the slow, invisible unraveling that comes before. And in Los Angeles, a city built on reinvention, the Ray's family had reached a point where one man decided there was no future worth surviving. What investigators would uncover next would reveal how quietly despair can grow, and how easily it can be missed until it's far too late. By the second week of the investigation, detectives understood that the murders inside apartment 4D were not the result of a single explosive argument, but the culmination of a long, quiet collapse that had gone unnoticed by almost everyone outside the Rays household. Daniel Reyes had not always been a man under pressure. Friends from his early 20s described him as methodical, ambitious, and deeply concerned with appearances. He was the kind of person who believed that if he worked hard enough and followed the rules, stability would follow. When he met Marisol Alvarez at a friend's birthday party in Riverside, he seemed to embody that promise. He had a steady job, a car he kept meticulously clean, and plans that extended years into the future. Marriage, home ownership, children who would never experience the instability he himself had grown up with. Marisol was drawn to that certainty. She came from a family that had lived paycheck to paycheck, where improvisation was a survival skill and long-term planning often felt impossible. Daniel offered something different: structure, predictability, safety. When they married in 2015, their life felt balanced. His practicality complemented her creativity. She brought warmth into his rigid routines. He brought order to her artistic chaos. For a while, it worked. The move to Los Angeles in 2019 was Daniel's idea. He believed bigger cities meant bigger opportunities, better salaries, better schools, better futures. Marisol was hesitant. She worried about the cost of living, about isolation, about losing the small support network they had built. But Daniel framed the move as necessary, a sacrifice now for long-term gain, and Marisol trusted him. The first year in LA went well enough. Daniel landed a position with a logistics company servicing West Coast distributors. The pay wasn't extraordinary, but it was steady. Marisol picked up design work through online platforms, building a client list slowly. When Sophia was born in early 2017, they leaned fully into the idea of being a team. Daniel worked longer hours. Marisol stayed home more. They told themselves it was temporary. Then the cracks started to widen. By 2021, the logistics industry was under strain. Supply chain disruptions led to longer hours and higher expectations. Daniel's job shifted from predictable routines to constant firefighting. Mistakes were no longer small inconveniences. They cost contracts. They cost money. Daniel internalized every failure. He stopped talking about work. When Marisol asked how his day had been, he responded with one-word answers or silence. At home, the dynamic changed. Daniel became increasingly controlling about finances. He tracked every expense. He questioned grocery receipts. He scrolled through bank statements late into the night, muttering to himself. Marisol noticed the tension, but she also noticed something else: fear. Daniel was terrified of falling behind. Text messages recovered later showed how that fear manifested. He blamed himself for not earning enough. Then he blamed Marisol for not contributing more. Then he blamed the city, the economy, the system, anyone but the reality that things were unraveling faster than he could control. Marisol began to withdraw. She stopped inviting friends over. She stopped posting family photos online. When she did talk to her sister, she downplayed the stress. "It's just money," she said. "Everyone's struggling." But behind closed doors, Daniel's behavior became unpredictable. He wasn't physically violent, not yet, but he would stand too close when he was angry. He would pace for hours. He would sit silently in the dark after Sophia went to bed, staring at nothing. One message Marisol sent to a friend stood out to detectives. "It's like he's already gone somewhere else, like he's living in a future where we don't exist." By late 2023, the financial situation was dire. Credit card debt had ballooned. Daniel had taken out short-term loans to cover rent. He lied to Marisol about a performance warning at work, telling her everything was fine while privately searching for jobs late at night. His browser history revealed dozens of applications submitted, none resulting in interviews. The pressure became unbearable. On the surface, nothing changed. Daniel still walked Sophia to school some mornings. Marisol still cooked dinner. Neighbors still saw them passing in the hallway, polite and quiet. But inside the apartment, conversations turned into interrogations. Silence turned into resentment. Hope turned into something darker. Investigators later reconstructed the final weekend. On Friday night, the family ate dinner together. Sophia talked excitedly about school. Marisol smiled. Daniel barely touched his food. After Sophia went to bed, Daniel and Marisol argued in hushed voices. It wasn't loud enough for neighbors to hear, but it was intense. Marisol told him she wanted to move back closer to family. She told him she was scared. She told him she didn't recognize the man she married. Daniel heard only one thing: failure. Sometime after midnight, Daniel left the apartment. Security footage showed him entering a nearby convenience store. He bought beer and a pack of cigarettes. He stood in the parking lot for several minutes, staring at his phone, typing and deleting messages he never sent. He returned home just after 1:00 a.m. What happened next would never be fully known, but forensic evidence painted a grim outline. Marisol was struck from behind in the living room. There were no defensive wounds. Investigators believe she never saw it coming. Sophia was killed shortly after, likely while asleep. The medical examiner later stated that her death would have been quick, though not painless. Daniel's own death came last. He did not leave a note. What he did leave behind were answers hidden in his digital footprint. Searches that revealed a man who had convinced himself that death was a form of protection, that his family would be spared shame, that he was saving them from a future he could no longer provide. Behavioral experts noted a familiar pattern. Daniel did not view himself as a monster. He viewed himself as a solution. As the investigation continued, the public reaction intensified. News outlets debated whether cases like this should be labeled differently. Commentators argued about mental health, masculinity, financial pressure, and societal expectations. Online forums filled with anger, sympathy, and confusion. How could someone do this? How could no one see it coming? Marisol's family spoke publicly for the first time during the second week. Her sister stood in front of cameras, voice trembling but firm. She tried, she said. She tried to keep her child safe. She tried to get help, and she was trapped. In Los Angeles, the city moved on as it always does. Traffic resumed. New tenants toured the apartment complex. The yellow tape came down, but inside the Ray's apartment, time had stopped. And for investigators, the hardest part of the case was no longer finding answers. It was knowing that all the answers came too late. As the third phase of the investigation unfolded, detectives shifted their focus from reconstruction to accountability. There would be no arrest, no trial, no courtroom reckoning, but there would still be questions about responsibility, prevention, and whether this tragedy could have been interrupted before it reached its irreversible end. The Los Angeles County Medical Examiner released the final autopsy reports 3 weeks after the bodies were discovered. The findings confirmed what investigators already believed, but hoped might somehow be wrong. Marisol Reyes died from blunt force trauma to the head, delivered with enough force to cause immediate unconsciousness followed by fatal brain injury. There was no evidence she fought back. Sophia Reyes died from manual strangulation while asleep in her bed. There were no signs of prolonged struggle. Daniel Reyes died from a self-inflicted gunshot wound to the head. The order of deaths mattered. It reinforced the theory that this was not an argument that spiraled out of control, but a sequence of decisions made with grim intent. The firearm used in the killing had been purchased legally by Daniel 3 years earlier. California's waiting period, background check, and firearm safety requirements had all been met. There were no prior domestic violence reports, no restraining orders, no criminal record that would have barred him from ownership. On paper, the system had worked exactly as designed. That fact unsettled investigators more than anything else, because it meant there was no single institutional failure to blame. No missed 911 call, no ignored restraining order, no warning flag that would have automatically triggered intervention. Instead, there were dozens of small signals, subtle changes, quiet confessions, unsent messages, private suffering that never crossed a legal threshold. The district attorney's office officially closed the case in early October. The ruling was clear: a double homicide followed by suicide. Case closed. No charges, no further action. But the story didn't end there. Public response intensified after Marisol's private messages were leaked to the press through a family source. Headlines shifted tone. What had initially been framed as a tragic family collapse began to be discussed through a different lens: coercive control, emotional isolation, and the silent escalation of psychological abuse. Domestic violence advocates pointed out a painful truth. Not all abuse leaves bruises. Control over finances, isolation from support systems, emotional intimidation. These behaviors rarely trigger immediate intervention, but they create conditions where victims feel trapped long before physical violence appears. Marisol had tried to keep life normal. She packed Sophia's school bag. She cooked meals. She smiled for neighbors. Like many victims, she believed that stability, for her child, for appearances, was something she had to maintain at all costs. Detectives interviewed her close friends again. In hindsight, the warning signs seemed obvious: her reluctance to make plans, her hesitation before answering questions about her marriage, her habit of lowering her voice when Daniel entered the room. But hindsight is cruelly precise. Daniel's family issued a brief statement through an attorney. They expressed devastation and apologized to Marisol's family. They asked for privacy. They declined further comment. Internally, they struggled with their own grief, complicated by the unbearable reality that their son had not only died, but had taken 2 innocent lives with him. Behavioral analysts consulted by LAPT prepared an internal report that would later be used for training. Daniel Reyes fit what experts classify as a self-righteous family annihilator. Unlike impulsive offenders, this type believes their actions are justified. They see themselves as victims of circumstance, forced into an impossible position. In their distorted logic, killing their family is not cruelty, it is mercy. This mindset is particularly dangerous because it often lacks obvious red flags. These individuals rarely threaten violence. They often avoid police contact. They internalize shame rather than externalizing rage until the pressure becomes unbearable. In the weeks that followed, Sophia's school held a memorial assembly. Her teacher described her as gentle, curious, and eager to help others. Classmates released balloons into the sky, each one carrying a handwritten message. "I miss you. I hope you're happy. I'll never forget you." Marisol's clients shared her work online, turning her designs into a digital memorial. Friends organized a fundraiser in her name to support survivors of domestic abuse. It raised over $80,000 in less than a month. The apartment complex replaced the carpet on the 4th floor. Apartment 4D sat empty for months. Eventually, it was renovated, repainted, and relisted. There is no plaque, no marker, nothing to indicate what happened inside those walls. Los Angeles moved on, as cities always do. But among law enforcement, the case lingered. It became a reference point, a cautionary example used in briefings and training sessions, not because it was unique, but because it was. Cases like this happen quietly in ordinary homes to ordinary families. They do not announce themselves with sirens or prior arrests. They grow in silence. As the year came to a close, Marisol's sister spoke again, this time at a domestic violence awareness conference. She didn't speak about Daniel, she spoke about Marisol. She wasn't weak, she said. She was surviving. She was planning. She was protecting her child the best way she knew how, and she deserved more time. The audience stood in silence, because the hardest truth of the Ray's case was not how it ended. It was how many chances there were for it to end differently, and how none of them were loud enough to be heard. In the months after the Ray's case was officially closed, its aftershocks continued to ripple quietly through institutions that rarely speak to one another unless tragedy forces the conversation. There was no public trial, no televised verdict, no sentence handed down by a judge. Yet the questions left behind were heavier than any courtroom outcome. Los Angeles County convened an internal review panel made up of representatives from law enforcement, social services, mental health advocacy groups, and domestic violence prevention organizations. The panel's mandate was narrow but urgent. Identify whether existing systems had any realistic opportunity to intervene before the killings, and if so, where those opportunities failed. The conclusions were uncomfortable. There had been no calls to police, no restraining orders, no medical records indicating imminent danger, no school reports of abuse. Sophia had been a happy child by all outward measures. Marisol had continued working. Daniel had shown up to his job until he stopped. Every system that relies on visible signals had seen nothing. What the panel emphasized instead was something harder to quantify: cumulative isolation. Marisol had withdrawn socially over the course of 2 years. Friends noticed but did not push. Coworkers sensed stress but assumed financial pressure or parenting fatigue. Her family lived out of state and spoke to her mostly through short calls and text messages. Daniel had gradually positioned himself as the center of the household's decision-making, particularly finances. He managed the accounts. He decided when they would move. He controlled the narrative of their struggles. None of this was illegal. All of it was dangerous. Experts explained that coercive control often thrives in the absence of overt violence. It erodes autonomy so slowly that victims may not recognize it as abuse until escape feels impossible. By the time physical danger becomes imminent, isolation has already done its work. Following the panel's findings, Los Angeles County announced expanded funding for community-based domestic violence outreach programs. These programs would not rely solely on police intervention, but instead focus on early engagement through workplaces, schools, healthcare providers, and community centers. The goal was not punishment, but interruption. Sophia's death, in particular, reshaped conversations around child welfare. Educators were encouraged to receive additional training on recognizing subtle signs of household distress, even when no abuse is apparent. Pediatricians were reminded that parental stress can be a warning signal worth addressing early, not dismissing as routine exhaustion. None of these changes could bring back Marisol or Sophia, but policymakers hoped they might save someone else. Daniel Ray's actions were also studied extensively by behavioral scientists. His digital footprint, recovered devices, and financial records painted a picture of a man who felt cornered by failure, mounting debt, career stagnation, a belief that he had lost respect in the eyes of others. Yet there was no evidence of psychosis, no substance abuse, no violent criminal history. What emerged instead was entitlement fused with despair. Analysts concluded that Daniel did not view his family as separate individuals with their own right to survive. He viewed them as extensions of himself. When his identity collapsed, he decided their existence could not continue without him. This pattern, experts warned, remains one of the most difficult forms of violence to predict because it masquerades as normalcy until the final act. The Ray's case was added to national databases used for studying family annihilation. Its details would inform research, training manuals, and prevention models for years to come. For Marisol's family, the aftermath was quieter but no less painful. Her sister became Sophia's voice in public spaces, advocating for survivor support and early intervention programs. She refused interviews that focused on Daniel. "I won't let him be the headline," she said. "This story is about who we lost." On Sophia's birthday, a small group gathered at a local park. They planted a tree. Children played nearby, unaware of its meaning. The plaque beneath it read only her name and the words, "Loved beyond measure." Life relentlessly continued. Apartment 4D eventually gained new tenants. They painted over the walls, they rearranged the rooms, they lived ordinary lives. There were no reports of disturbances. No shadows lingered. Tragedy does not haunt spaces, it haunts people. Years from now, the Ray's case may be remembered only by professionals who study it, advocates who reference it, and a family who lives with its absence every day. It will not become folklore. It will not be dramatized endlessly. It will fade as most real tragedies do, but its lessons remain stark. Violence does not always announce itself with chaos. Sometimes it grows in silence, fed by shame, control, and isolation. Sometimes the most dangerous moments come not from visible conflict, but from private despair left unspoken. Marisol Reyes tried to protect her child by holding her world together. Sophia trusted the adults around her to keep her safe. Both deserved more than what they were given. Their story reminds us that prevention does not begin with sirens or handcuffs. It begins with listening more closely, asking harder questions, taking quiet suffering seriously before it becomes irreversible. Because once silence turns into violence, there is no undoing what follows. And by the time the world finally notices, it is already too late. Story 4. On a cold autumn evening in November 2014, the quiet suburban streets of Waukesha, Wisconsin, were wrapped in an early darkness that came too quickly that time of year. Porch lights glowed softly, illuminating tidy lawns and modest homes where families were settling in for the night. It was the kind of place where people believed terrible things happened somewhere else. On the news, in faraway cities, not here. But that night, inside a small house on Big Bend Road, a crime unfolded that would shatter that illusion forever and force the nation to confront a disturbing truth about trust, vulnerability, and the hidden dangers that can exist even in the safest-seeming communities. The victims were not strangers to one another. They were not caught in a random act of violence. They were bound by blood, by years of shared routines, by the ordinary intimacy of family life. And the person responsible was someone who had been welcomed into the home, someone who knew where the knives were kept, who knew the layout of the rooms, who understood exactly how to move without raising immediate suspicion. This is the story of the Shabbosness case, a case that would later dominate headlines not only for the brutality of the crime, but for the unsettling questions it raised about mental illness, accountability, and how systems fail long before tragedy makes itself impossible to ignore. Shad Tharian was 25 years old in the fall of 2014. Friends described him as quiet, soft-spoken, and deeply loyal to the people he cared about. He had grown up in Wisconsin, navigating adulthood with the same mix of hope and uncertainty that defines so many young lives. He worked sporadically, struggled at times to find direction, but remained close to his mother, Carol Tharian. Carol was the anchor in his life. A single parent who had worked hard to provide stability, she was known among neighbors as kind, reliable, and deeply protective of her son. Carol lived with her boyfriend, Adam, in the Big Bend home. Adam had his own complicated past, including struggles with substance abuse, but he had been trying to rebuild his life. The household was not perfect, but it functioned. They shared meals, talked about bills, watched television in the evenings. It was ordinary, imperfect, human. Morgan Shabbosness entered their lives through a web of overlapping relationships common in small towns. She was 24 years old, with a history that included drug use, unstable housing, and untreated mental health issues. She had known Adam for years and was familiar with Carol and Shad. She had stayed at the house before. She was not viewed as dangerous. She was viewed as troubled, someone who drifted in and out, someone who needed help. Morgan's life had been marked by instability from a young age. School records showed frequent absences. Family members later described years of erratic behavior, periods of paranoia, and increasing drug use. Methamphetamine, in particular, would come to play a central role in her story. Despite these warning signs, Morgan moved through systems that struggled to contain her. She had encounters with law enforcement, but none that resulted in long-term intervention. She had brief interactions with mental health services, but nothing sustained. By November 2014, Morgan's life was spiraling. She had few stable relationships, little money, and a growing dependence on drugs. Yet she still retained access to people who trusted her enough to open their doors. On the evening of November 1st, Morgan arrived at the Big Bend Roadhouse. She and Shad spent time together, talking, smoking marijuana, and later using methamphetamine. According to later testimony, the atmosphere initially felt relaxed. There was no argument, no obvious trigger. Carol went to bed, believing her son was safe in his own home, surrounded by people he knew. What happened next would later be reconstructed through forensic evidence, Morgan's own statements, and the horrifying discoveries made the following day. At some point during the night, Morgan and Shad went into the basement. The details of what occurred there are disturbing, but investigators would later determine that Morgan strangled Shad using a chain. The act was prolonged and violent. There was no evidence of self-defense. There was no sign of a struggle that suggested mutual combat. This was an intentional killing, but the violence did not end with Shad's death. After killing him, Morgan remained in the house. She did not flee. She did not call for help. Instead, she began to mutilate Shad's body. She dismembered him using knives from the kitchen. She decapitated him. She engaged in acts so extreme that even seasoned investigators struggled to process the scene. Some of Shad's remains were placed in bags. Others were left behind. His head was later discovered in a bucket in the basement. His torso was found elsewhere in the home. Blood evidence indicated movement between rooms, suggesting Morgan had ample time and was not acting in a sudden panic. By morning, Carol Tharian awoke to a nightmare no parent should ever face. She discovered parts of her son's body and immediately called 911. Her screams on the recorded call were raw, primal, filled with disbelief. She could not comprehend how such horror had occurred while she slept only a few rooms away. Police arrived to a scene unlike anything the small Waukesha County Department was accustomed to handling. The house was sealed off. State investigators were called in. The basement became the focus of intense forensic examination. Officers quickly identified Morgan Shabbosness as the primary suspect. Morgan had not gotten far. She was located later that day, disoriented and covered in blood. When questioned, she made statements that oscillated between incoherent rambling and chilling calm. She admitted to killing Shad. She spoke about being high and about voices. At times she laughed. At other times she cried. From the very beginning, the case posed a profound challenge. Morgan was clearly mentally unwell. She was also undeniably responsible for an act of extreme violence. The question would become not whether she committed the crime, but how the justice system should respond to someone whose mind appeared fractured beyond repair. As news of the crime spread, the community of Waukesha was stunned. People locked their doors earlier. Parents hugged their children tighter. Neighbors gathered in small groups, whispering about what had happened just down the street. The Thyrian family became the focus of an outpouring of grief and support. Vigils were held. Flowers lined the sidewalk. Shad's face appeared on local news broadcasts, his smile frozen in photographs that now felt unbearably fragile. But alongside the grief came fear. Fear not just of Morgan Shabazz, but of the idea that someone so clearly unwell could move through society with so few barriers. That she could enter a home, spend the night, and commit unspeakable violence without anyone intervening beforehand. As prosecutors prepared charges, they knew this would not be a straightforward case. The brutality ensured maximum charges, including first-degree intentional homicide. But Morgan's mental state raised immediate questions about competency. Could she understand the proceedings? Could she assist in her own defense? Was she criminally responsible, or should she be confined to a mental health institution instead of a prison? These questions would take years to answer. For Carol Thyrian, the legal complexities were secondary. Her world had ended the moment she found her son's remains. She would later speak about the unbearable guilt of not waking up sooner, of not sensing danger, of trusting someone who should never have been trusted. No explanation, no verdict could give her peace. The Shabazz case was only just beginning. What lay ahead would involve repeated delays, psychiatric evaluations, courtroom outbursts, and public debates about where compassion ends and accountability must begin. This was not just a murder case. It was a mirror held up to a system that struggles to deal with people who fall through every crack. And as the investigation moved forward, one thing became painfully clear. Whatever the outcome, nothing would ever restore the life that had been taken, or erase the knowledge that unimaginable violence had occurred in the place where Shad Thyrian should have been safest. This was only the beginning. In the weeks following the murder, as investigators continued to process the crime scene and assemble evidence, the Shabazz case began to shift from a horrific local tragedy into a national conversation. The brutality of what had occurred inside the Big Bend Road home was almost impossible to reconcile with the mundane details of everyday life that surrounded it. A quiet basement, familiar furniture, a mother sleeping upstairs. The contrast haunted everyone involved. Morgan Shabazz was formally charged with first-degree intentional homicide, mutilating a corpse, and degree sexual assault. Each charge carried significant weight, but it was the homicide count that ensured this case would follow a long and complex legal path. From the outset, prosecutors acknowledged that while the physical evidence was overwhelming, the defendant's mental state would dominate every stage of the proceedings. Shortly after her arrest, Morgan was ordered to undergo a competency evaluation. The court needed to determine whether she understood the nature of the charges against her, and whether she was capable of assisting her attorneys in her defense. This process, usually routine, quickly became anything but. Psychiatrists evaluating Morgan documented severe mental health disturbances. She exhibited delusional thinking, disorganized speech, and erratic behavior. At times she claimed to hear voices. At other times she denied any memory of the crime, only to later provide disturbing details. Her drug use further complicated the picture, making it difficult to separate substance-induced psychosis from underlying psychiatric illness. During early court appearances, Morgan's behavior was unpredictable. She laughed at inappropriate moments. She stared blankly at the judge. She interrupted proceedings with nonsensical comments. In one hearing, she appeared to smile while discussing the evidence against her. These moments circulated widely in media coverage, sparking outrage and confusion among the public. Many questioned how someone capable of such behavior could ever stand trial. For Shad Thyrian's family, each court appearance was a reopening of wounds. Carol Thyrian attended hearings when she could, supported by relatives and victim advocates. She listened as attorneys spoke clinically about her son's body, about chains and knives and blood patterns. She later said that the hardest part was hearing Shad reduced to evidence, his humanity stripped away in service of legal precision. As months passed, Morgan was repeatedly found incompetent to stand trial. Each time, the court ordered her committed to a state mental health facility for treatment aimed at restoring competency. This cycle became agonizingly familiar. Morgan would be sent to a hospital. Doctors would attempt to stabilize her with medication. Reports would be filed. She would return to court. And again, she would be deemed unfit. The delays infuriated some members of the public who saw the process as justice denied. Online commentary grew increasingly hostile. People demanded swift punishment. Others argued that executing or imprisoning someone so clearly mentally ill would be a moral failure. The case became a lightning rod for debates about criminal responsibility and mental health care in America. Behind the scenes, prosecutors faced difficult decisions. They had to prepare for multiple possible outcomes. If Morgan were eventually deemed competent, they would proceed to trial and seek the maximum penalty under Wisconsin law, which does not include the death penalty, but allows for life imprisonment without the possibility of release. If she were never restored to competency, the case could end with her confined indefinitely to a mental health institution, a result that felt unsatisfying to those seeking accountability. As time stretched on, new details emerged that deepened the horror of the crime. Forensic analysts reconstructed the timeline of the night. They determined that Morgan had ample opportunity to stop, to leave, to seek help. Instead, she remained in the home for hours after killing Shad. She ate food from the kitchen. She moved calmly through the house. This behavior suggested not a momentary loss of control, but sustained engagement with the aftermath of her actions. Investigators also uncovered Morgan's extensive history of drug use, particularly methamphetamine. Friends and acquaintances described her as increasingly paranoid in the weeks leading up to the murder. She believed people were following her. She claimed others were conspiring against her. Yet despite these warning signs, she had not been hospitalized or placed under long-term supervision. This failure haunted mental health professionals who later reviewed the case. They pointed to systemic issues, lack of resources, fragmented care, high thresholds for involuntary commitment. Morgan had not met the criteria for confinement until it was far too late. Meanwhile, Shad Thyrian's life was remembered in quiet ways. A memorial service was held where friends spoke about his kindness, his gentle humor, his loyalty. They described a young man who tried to help others, who believed in giving people second chances. Many struggled with the irony that this very compassion may have contributed to his vulnerability. Carol Thyrian became an unwilling symbol of parental grief. She spoke publicly only a few times, her voice steady but heavy with pain. She expressed anger not just at Morgan, but at a system that allowed someone so unstable to circulate freely. She asked questions no one could answer. Why wasn't there more help? Why didn't someone intervene earlier? Why did her son have to pay the price? As the case dragged into its second year, it became clear that resolution would not come quickly. Morgan's mental health remained unstable. Medications produced temporary improvements, but her condition fluctuated. At times, she appeared lucid and cooperative. At others, she regressed, slipping back into delusion and agitation. The court continued to monitor her progress, balancing the rights of the accused with the rights of the victim's family. Judges expressed frustration but remained bound by legal standards. They could not proceed unless Morgan was competent. To do otherwise would violate constitutional protections and risk overturning any conviction on appeal. The Shabbosness case thus existed in a kind of legal limbo, suspended between horror and uncertainty. It forced everyone involved to confront uncomfortable truths. That justice is not always swift. That accountability is complicated when illness and violence intersect. That prevention often fails quietly, long before sirens and crime scene tape appear. As years passed, public attention waxed and waned, but for those closest to the case, there was no forgetting. Every delay felt like another loss. Every hearing reopened the same questions. And still, one fundamental issue remained unresolved. Would Morgan Shabbosness ever be held fully accountable in a criminal court, or would her case end as a tragic example of a system overwhelmed by complexity? The answer would take even more time to emerge, and when it did, it would raise still deeper questions about punishment, protection, and what society owes both the innocent dead and the deeply broken living. The story was far from over. By the time the case entered its next phase, the atmosphere around it had changed. What had once been raw shock hardened into something heavier, a mixture of exhaustion and dread. The question was no longer what had happened inside that basement, but what the justice system could realistically do now that the crime had been fully exposed and yet remained unresolved. In late 2023, Morgan Shabbosness was once again transported from a state mental health facility back to Brown County Circuit Court. This time, doctors reported cautious progress. Medication had reduced the intensity of her hallucinations. Her speech was more coherent. She could identify the judge, her attorneys, and the charges against her. She appeared calmer, more contained. For the first time, the possibility of moving forward felt real. The courtroom was tense. Shad Thyrian's family sat quietly, bracing themselves for whatever came next. Prosecutors spoke carefully, aware that every word mattered. Defense attorneys listened closely, ready to challenge any claim that Morgan was fully competent. The judge reviewed the psychiatric reports line by line, asking pointed questions about whether Morgan truly understood the gravity of her situation or was simply repeating learned responses. After hours of testimony, the court ruled that Morgan was competent to stand trial. The decision sent ripples through the courtroom. For the Thyrian family, it was both relief and fear. Relief that the case might finally move forward, fear of reliving the details in full during a public trial. For Morgan, the ruling meant a return to jail and the beginning of formal legal proceedings that could end with her spending the rest of her life behind bars. Almost immediately, the defense signaled its strategy. They would not dispute that Morgan killed Shad Thyrian. The evidence made that impossible. Instead, they would argue that she was not guilty by reason of mental disease or defect. In Wisconsin, this plea requires the defense to prove that the defendant, due to mental illness, lacked substantial capacity to appreciate the wrongfulness of their conduct or to conform their behavior to the law. This approach shifted the case into even more complicated territory. A trial would no longer be about whether the crime occurred, but about Morgan's mind at the time it occurred. Every detail of her past, her mental health history, her drug use, her behavior before and after the murder would be scrutinized. Prosecutors prepared to counter the insanity defense aggressively. They assembled expert witnesses who would testify that despite Morgan's mental illness, her actions demonstrated awareness and intent. They pointed to her efforts to clean the crime scene, to move the body, to conceal evidence. These behaviors, they argued, showed she knew what she had done was wrong. The pretrial motions were intense and deeply emotional. Defense attorneys sought to exclude certain graphic photographs, arguing they would unfairly prejudice the jury. Prosecutors countered that the images were necessary to show the extent of the crime and the deliberateness of Morgan's actions. The judge allowed some evidence and barred others, attempting to strike a balance between truth and humanity. Media coverage surged once again. Court filings were dissected online. Commentators argued fiercely about mental illness, responsibility, and punishment. Some expressed sympathy for Morgan, describing her as a product of systemic failure. Others rejected any mitigation, insisting that Shad's suffering and death outweighed all other considerations. Throughout this period, Morgan's behavior remained erratic. On some days, she appeared engaged with her attorneys, asking questions and discussing strategy. On other days, she withdrew, staring at the floor, speaking only when prompted. Jail staff documented mood swings, agitation, and occasional outbursts. The stability achieved through medication was fragile. Behind closed doors, prosecutors wrestled with a decision that would shape the case's outcome. They could proceed to a full jury trial, risking an insanity verdict that might place Morgan back into a mental health facility rather than prison. Or they could pursue a plea agreement that ensured she would never be released, even if it meant avoiding a public trial. For the Thyrion family, the uncertainty was agonizing. They met repeatedly with victim advocates and prosecutors, asking hard questions. What would an insanity verdict actually mean? How long could Morgan be confined? Could she ever be released? The answers were never absolute. Civil commitment could last a lifetime, but it was subject to periodic review. Nothing felt permanent. Carol Thyrion spoke privately with prosecutors about what justice meant to her. She said she did not seek revenge. She wanted safety. She wanted assurance that the person who killed her son would never harm anyone else. She wanted her son's name remembered for who he was, not just how he died. As trial preparations continued, expert reports painted a chilling picture of Morgan's internal world. Some doctors described her as deeply disturbed, plagued by violent fantasies and compulsive thoughts. Others emphasized her capacity for planning and manipulation. The contrast highlighted the difficulty of categorizing human behavior into legal definitions. The looming trial promised to be one of the most disturbing the county had ever seen. Jurors would be asked to listen to explicit testimony, to view evidence that tested the limits of endurance, and then to decide not only what happened, but whether the person responsible could be held fully accountable. As the trial date approached, the weight of the case pressed down on everyone involved. Prosecutors worked late nights. Defense attorneys prepared for the fight of their careers. The judge reviewed motions with visible fatigue. And Shad Thyrion's family prepared themselves to hear, once again, the story of the night that took him from them. The system was finally moving, but the cost of that movement was emotional devastation for all involved. And beneath it all lingered a question that no verdict could truly answer. When mental illness and extreme violence collide, is justice something that can ever feel complete? The trial would soon begin, and with it, the most painful chapter yet. The final phase of the case unfolded under a heavy silence that settled over the courtroom each morning before proceedings began. By now, everyone involved understood that there would be no clean resolution, no outcome that could fully restore what had been lost. What remained was the obligation to see the process through, to give shape to accountability even when the answers felt incomplete. Jury selection took days. Potential jurors were questioned carefully, sometimes painfully, about their ability to hear graphic testimony and remain impartial. Many were excused after admitting they could not separate emotion from judgment. Those who remained carried a quiet gravity, aware that their role would require confronting details most people never want to imagine. When opening statements began, the courtroom was packed. Prosecutors spoke first, their tone deliberate and restrained. They laid out a timeline of events, emphasizing not just the violence itself, but the choices made before and after. They described actions taken to conceal evidence, decisions that required awareness and intent. This, they argued, was not a crime committed in a fog of confusion, but one carried out with disturbing clarity. The defense followed with a different narrative. They did not deny the brutality. Instead, they framed it as the result of a mind fractured beyond control. They spoke of long-standing mental illness, untreated symptoms, escalating drug use, and a system that failed to intervene before catastrophe struck. They asked the jury to consider whether punishment without understanding served any meaningful purpose. Testimony stretched over weeks. Forensic experts described the scene in clinical detail. Investigators explained how evidence was collected, how timelines were established, how conclusions were reached. Medical professionals testified about brain chemistry, psychosis, and the ways in which reality can fracture under severe mental illness. Each witness added another layer, another angle, another burden for the jury to carry. Some moments were almost unbearable. Audio recordings were played, photographs were shown, jurors looked away, some wiping tears from their faces. The judge paused proceedings more than once to allow people to regain composure. Even seasoned professionals admitted privately that the case tested their limits. Throughout the trial, Morgan remained mostly silent. At times she stared straight ahead, expressionless. At other moments, she whispered to her attorneys or shifted restlessly in her seat. When testimony touched on particularly graphic details, she sometimes covered her ears, as though trying to shut out a story that was also her own. The Thyrian family endured every day of testimony. They listened to strangers describe their son's final moments in detached language. They watched jurors react to evidence that would now forever define public memory of Shad's death. And still, they came back each morning, sitting together, holding hands, refusing to let his name be reduced to a case number. Closing arguments brought the emotional weight to its peak. Prosecutors urged the jury to focus on actions, not diagnoses. Mental illness, they acknowledged, was real and devastating, but it did not erase responsibility. The defense responded by asking jurors to look beyond the surface of behavior and into the mind that produced it, arguing that punishment without treatment was not justice, but avoidance. Deliberations were tense and prolonged. The jury asked to review evidence multiple times. They requested clarification on legal definitions. Hours turned into days. Outside the courthouse, reporters waited, cameras ready, while families paced and lawyers tried to remain calm. When the verdict finally came, the courtroom filled once more. The jurors filed in slowly, their faces drawn. The foreperson stood and read the decision. The outcome reflected the complexity of the case, acknowledging both the severity of the crime and the reality of mental illness. The sentence ensured that Morgan would be confined indefinitely, with no guarantee of release, regardless of whether that confinement occurred in a prison or a secure mental health facility. There were no cheers, no cries of victory, only quiet exhalations. For the Thyrian family, the verdict brought a measure of safety, but not peace. No ruling could return Shad or erase the images now etched into their lives. Still, they spoke afterward with dignity, emphasizing remembrance over rage. In the months that followed, the case faded from headlines, replaced by new tragedies, new names. But its impact lingered. It became a reference point in discussions about mental health care, substance abuse, and the limits of the justice system. It forced uncomfortable conversations about how society identifies danger, how it intervenes, and how often it fails to do either in time. For those closest to the case, life moved forward in altered ways. The Thyrian family focused on honoring Shad's memory, speaking about kindness, connection, and the importance of looking out for one another. Advocates used the case to push for better mental health resources, hoping that awareness might prevent even one future tragedy. And somewhere behind locked doors, Morgan lived within the consequences of her actions, monitored, medicated, and isolated from the world she shattered. Whether she fully understood the magnitude of what she had done remained a question without a clear answer. The story ended not with resolution, but with reflection. A reminder that true crime is not entertainment for those who live it, but an enduring wound. A reminder that violence leaves ripples far beyond the moment it occurs. And a reminder that justice, even when delivered, is often a fragile and imperfect thing. In the end, what remained was the quiet insistence that Shad Thyrian was more than the way he died. He was a son, a brother, a friend. And his life, though cut short, continued to matter long after the courtroom doors closed. Story 5. The night began the way so many others did, quietly and without warning. The kind of night that would later be dissected frame by strangers who wished they could go back and intervene. In the small riverside town of Larkin Falls, Ohio, the air carried the damp chill of early autumn, and porch lights flickered on one by one as families settled into routines they trusted would repeat the next day. Nothing about that evening suggested it would become a reference point, a before and after marker etched permanently into the town's memory. Emily Harper tucked her 6-year-old son, Noah, into bed just after 8:30. He complained about the darkness, about the shadows that moved when cars passed outside. She kissed his forehead, promised to leave the hallway light on, and reminded him she would be right downstairs if he needed her. It was a ritual they had followed since her divorce finalized the previous spring. Stability, she believed, was built through repetition. Downstairs, Emily moved through the quiet house, collecting toys, loading the dishwasher, folding laundry she had already folded once before. She checked her phone more often than she realized, refreshing messages that never came. The custody exchange earlier that afternoon had been tense. Her ex-husband, Daniel Harper, had arrived late again, eyes ringed with exhaustion, voice clipped and defensive. He had barely looked at Noah when he dropped him off. To Emily, the changes in Daniel were impossible to ignore. He had once been meticulous, punctual, almost rigid in his routines. Over the past year, he had unraveled in subtle ways at first. Missed deadlines at work, angry outbursts over small inconveniences, long silences where he stared through conversations instead of participating in them. She told herself it was not her responsibility anymore. The marriage was over. She had fought hard to create a safer environment for herself and her son. Still, as she locked the front door that night, she felt a flicker of unease she couldn't name. Across town, Daniel sat alone in his pickup truck outside a closed grocery store, engine idling, headlights off. The glow from his phone illuminated his face in sharp angles as he scrolled through bank statements, email notifications, and unanswered messages. The numbers no longer added up, no matter how many times he ran them. Child support, rent, credit card debt. The severance package he had believed would carry him through had evaporated faster than he anticipated. He opened his glove compartment and removed a folded piece of paper, creased and worn. A custody agreement, annotated in his own handwriting. Margins filled with notes, calculations, questions that never received answers. The language of the document felt cold and absolute, indifferent to his panic. Daniel had not always felt like this. He remembered a version of himself who believed problems could be solved through effort, through planning, through sheer persistence. That belief had sustained him for decades. Losing his job shattered it. Losing his family finished the work. At 9:12 p.m., A neighbor's security camera captured Daniel's truck pulling onto the highway, heading toward Emily's neighborhood. Inside the Harper home, Emily had just finished brushing her teeth when she heard a sound that made her pause. A dull thud, followed by a faint vibration through the floor. She stood still, heart quickening, listening. The house settled around her, old pipes ticking, the refrigerator humming. She told herself it was nothing. Old houses made noise. Anxiety filled gaps where certainty should live. Then came the knock. It was not loud, not urgent. 3 measured taps against the front door. Emily checked the clock. 9:27 p.m. Her first thought was that it might be a neighbor. Her second thought, unwanted and sharp, was Daniel. She pushed it away. He wouldn't come unannounced. He knew better. He had promised to respect boundaries. She approached the door cautiously, peering through the side window. The porch light illuminated a familiar silhouette, shoulders slumped, hands shoved into jacket pockets. Her stomach dropped. She opened the door only a few inches, chain still attached. "Daniel," she said quietly, "you can't be here like this." He looked at her with an expression she couldn't immediately interpret. Not anger, not sadness. Something flatter, emptier. "I just need to talk," he said. 5 minutes. Emily shook her head. "It's late. Noah's asleep. This isn't okay." "I know," he replied quickly. "I know. I wouldn't ask if it wasn't important." The word important hung between them, heavy with implication. Emily considered closing the door. She should have. Instead, she disengaged the chain and stepped back, leaving the door open. Daniel entered slowly, glancing around the living room as though seeing it for the first time. The framed photos on the wall. The throw blanket folded neatly over the couch. Evidence of a life continuing without him. They stood several feet apart, the space between them charged. "I lost the apartment," Daniel said abruptly. "They're evicting me next week." Emily exhaled slowly. "I'm sorry, I didn't know." "I didn't want you to," he replied. "I didn't want you to think that I failed." The word cracked something open in him. His voice trembled, then steadied, as though he were forcing it back into control. Emily crossed her arms, instinctively protective. "Daniel, this isn't something we can fix tonight." He nodded. "I know, I just needed you to hear it from me, not through a lawyer." She glanced toward the staircase. "You should go." For a moment it seemed like he might comply. Then his gaze shifted, drifting past her upward. "Is he asleep?" he asked. "Yes," Emily said firmly. "And you're not waking him up." Daniel swallowed. "I just want to see him. I haven't had a real moment with him in weeks." "You had your time today." "An hour in a parking lot," he snapped, anger flaring suddenly. "That's what I get now." Emily's heart began to race. "Lower your voice." The silence that followed felt fragile, like glass stretched too thin. Daniel took a step forward. Emily stepped back. The sound of footsteps overhead broke the tension. "Mom." Noah's voice drifted down the stairs, small and uncertain. Emily turned instinctively. "Go back to bed, honey. Everything's fine." Daniel looked up, his face changing in a way that made Emily's breath catch. His eyes filled, then hardened, as though something inside him had reached a conclusion she was not privy to. "I didn't mean for it to happen like this," he said softly. "What?" Emily whispered. She never saw the movement that followed clearly. Only fragments. Daniel's hand reaching into his jacket. The glint of metal. The sound, impossibly loud in the enclosed space. Upstairs, Noah screamed. The neighbors would later report hearing a single gunshot, followed by another, and then a long, terrible silence. By the time police arrived, responding to multiple frantic calls, the house on Riverside Drive had become something else entirely. A crime scene. A story. A place people would slow down as they passed, wondering how something so ordinary could collapse so completely. Inside, the damage was already done. And as investigators began the slow process of reconstructing what had happened, they would discover that the warning signs had been there all along, scattered across months of overlooked desperation, untreated despair, and a man who believed that losing control meant losing everything. This was only the beginning. By the time the red and blue lights washed over Riverside Drive, the street had already begun to fill with half-open doors and whispered questions. Neighbors stood barefoot on porches, phones clutched in trembling hands, trying to understand how the familiar house with the maple tree out front had become the center of a nightmare. Police cruisers lined the curb, their engines humming, officers moving with controlled urgency as they secured the perimeter. Inside the Harper home, the air was thick with the smell of gunpowder and something metallic that clung to the back of the throat. Emily lay near the base of the staircase, her body positioned as if she had tried to turn, to shield, to reach for something just out of grasp. Upstairs in his bedroom, Noah was found unharmed physically but deeply traumatized, curled into a corner of his bed, sobbing so hard officers initially feared he was injured. He kept repeating the same words over and over, a broken loop of sound that cut through everyone who heard it. Daddy was mad. Daddy was mad. Daniel Harper was found in the living room, slumped against the wall, the weapon still in his hand. He was alive when officers reached him, barely. The self-inflicted gunshot wound had not been immediately fatal. Paramedics worked quickly, their movements efficient and detached in the way that only experience can produce. As they loaded Daniel onto a stretcher, one officer noticed his eyes tracking the ceiling, unfocused, as if he were watching something only he could see. He was pronounced dead less than an hour later at St. Luke's Medical Center. Detectives from the Larkin Falls Police Department arrived shortly after midnight, their expressions grim as they surveyed the scene. Lieutenant Mark Rivera, a 22-year veteran, took command. He had seen domestic homicides before. He knew the patterns, the arguments that escalated, the moments that snapped under pressure. Still, something about this case unsettled him. Perhaps it was the presence of the child. Perhaps it was how quickly everything had unraveled. Rivera moved slowly through the house, documenting every detail. The unlocked door, the absence of forced entry, the custody paperwork scattered on the coffee table, edges curled, coffee stains darkening the margins. A backpack near the door containing clothes, toiletries, and a folded blanket. A man prepared, at least partially, to leave his life behind. Upstairs, a small desk lamp still glowed in Noah's room, casting soft light over crayon drawings taped to the walls. One depicted a family holding hands under a sun that smiled too widely. Another showed a house split down the middle, one side darker than the other. Rivera paused longer than necessary, then stepped back into the hallway. As the investigation progressed, the story that emerged was one of accumulation rather than explosion. There was no single moment that explained what Daniel Harper had done. Instead, there were dozens of missed opportunities, quiet alarms that rang without anyone listening. Friends interviewed by police described Daniel as withdrawn but not violent. A former coworker recalled him breaking down in the parking lot weeks earlier, confessing that he didn't know how to keep going. He said he felt invisible, the coworker told detectives, like everything he built just disappeared. Emily's friends painted a different picture. They spoke of her fear, of the way she double-checked locks and avoided being alone after dark. Text messages recovered from her phone showed that she had expressed concern about Daniel's mental state to her sister just days before the shooting. "I don't think he's okay," one message read. "I'm worried about what he might do." But worry alone was not enough to trigger intervention. Court records revealed that Daniel had petitioned for a modification of the custody agreement 2 months earlier, citing financial hardship and emotional distress. The motion had been denied pending further evaluation. He had not attended the recommended counseling sessions. No follow-up had occurred. Child Protective Services became involved immediately after the shooting, placing Noah temporarily with Emily's sister, Rachel Thompson, while assessments were conducted. Rachel arrived at the hospital in shock, her clothes still stained with paint from the home renovation project she had been working on that evening. She would later say that walking into the pediatric unit and seeing Noah wrapped in a hospital blanket, eyes hollow and distant, was the most painful moment of her life. The media descended on Larkin Falls within days. News vans lined the streets. Headlines framed the tragedy in familiar terms. Custody dispute turns deadly. Family court failure ends in violence. Commentators debated warning signs, mental health resources, and the limits of the legal system. Emily Harper became a name spoken by strangers who never knew her voice, her laugh, or the quiet strength she carried through years of struggle. As reporters dug deeper, a more complex narrative began to surface. Daniel Harper's financial collapse was not sudden. He had been struggling for over a year, relying on credit to maintain appearances. Bank records showed mounting debt, late payments, and overdraft fees that compounded each month. His employer had documented declining performance and multiple warnings before his termination. Mental health professionals interviewed for the case emphasized the danger of untreated depression combined with perceived loss of identity. Daniel had been a provider, a planner, a man who defined himself by stability. When that stability eroded, so did his sense of worth. Yet none of this excused what he had done. The district attorney's office faced a difficult task. With the perpetrator dead, there would be no trial, no formal adjudication of guilt. Instead, they conducted a comprehensive review, releasing their findings in a detailed report that outlined the sequence of events and the systemic gaps that allowed the situation to escalate unchecked. The report acknowledged failures on multiple levels. The family court system, constrained by caseloads and limited resources, had not adequately addressed Daniel's mental health concerns. Employers bound by policy had offered minimal support beyond severance. Friends and colleagues, unsure of how to intervene, had watched from a distance. Perhaps most haunting were the recordings from the neighbor's security camera, obtained with consent. The footage showed Daniel's truck arriving, the lights cutting out, the stillness before the door opened. No audio captured what was said inside, but the timestamp marked the moment everything changed. Noah began therapy almost immediately. Child psychologists worked gently, helping him find words for memories that arrived in fragments and nightmares that refused to fade. He drew pictures during sessions, often depicting doors and staircases, always with someone standing at the top, watching. Rachel and her husband petitioned for permanent custody, determined to provide Noah with a sense of safety and continuity. The court granted their request within weeks. Emily's absence became a presence in the house, felt in quiet moments, in the way Noah sometimes reached for a hand that wasn't there. In Larkin Falls, the house on Riverside Drive was eventually sold. New owners painted the walls, replaced the carpet, tried to erase the past. But for those who remembered, the story lingered, a reminder that violence often grows in silence, that tragedies are rarely without warning. As the town returned to routine, investigators closed their files, but questions remained unanswered. Could this have been prevented? Should someone have acted sooner? And how many other families were living on the edge of a similar collapse, unseen and unheard? The answers, elusive and uncomfortable, would continue to ripple outward, long after the headlines faded, shaping conversations about mental health, custody, and the fragile line between despair and disaster. And at the center of it all was a child learning how to grow up in the shadow of a night that took everything familiar and turned it into something he would spend a lifetime trying to understand. In the months that followed, the The Harper case slipped from the national news cycle, but within Larkin Falls it became a quiet reference point, a tragedy people spoke about in lowered voices, usually prefaced with, "Do you remember the family on Riverside Drive?" The details blurred with time, but the unease remained sharp. For investigators, part 3 of the story unfolded not in the house or the hospital, but in conference rooms and court filings, where systems were examined under harsh fluorescent lights. Lieutenant Rivera was called to testify before a state oversight committee reviewing domestic violence prevention and family court procedures. He sat at a long table, hands folded, listening as lawmakers dissected the case in clinical language. They asked about warning signs, about response times, about what could realistically have been done differently. Rivera answered carefully. He spoke about how violence rarely announces itself with certainty, how police often arrive only after a line has been crossed. He reminded the committee that Daniel Harper had no criminal history, no restraining orders against him, no documented acts of physical violence prior to that night. "We respond to what's reported," Rivera said, "and sometimes what's reported isn't enough to stop what's coming." Behind the official testimony, quieter discoveries continued. Emily Harper's laptop, returned to her family after forensic review, revealed journal entries saved in draft emails that were never sent. She had written to a close friend months earlier, describing a sense of being watched, of feeling responsible for Daniel's emotional stability even after their separation. "If I set boundaries, he falls apart," one entry read. "If I don't, I disappear." Those words struck a chord with advocates who later reviewed the case. They recognized the pattern immediately: emotional dependency masked as vulnerability, control disguised as fragility. Daniel's phone records told their own story. In the weeks leading up to the shooting, he had attempted to contact Emily dozens of times, often late at night. When calls went unanswered, text messages followed, alternating between apologies and accusations. Forensic psychologists later described the pattern as emotional oscillation, a hallmark of individuals experiencing perceived abandonment combined with loss of control. None of this absolved him, but it provided context that many found unsettling. Meanwhile, Noah's world narrowed to therapy rooms, school hallways, and the quiet stability Rachel and her husband tried to provide. He returned to school 3 months after the shooting, his backpack heavier than before, not with books but with invisible weight. Teachers were briefed. Classmates were told to be kind. Some were. Others didn't know how. At night, Noah slept with the hallway light on. He asked the same questions repeatedly. Why was Daddy mad? Why didn't Mommy come back? The answers were never enough, never simple, and always left him unsatisfied. Rachel attended a support group for families affected by domestic homicide. In those rooms, she heard stories that echoed her own in ways that were both comforting and horrifying. Different names, different towns, the same patterns: financial stress, custody disputes, untreated mental illness, silence. She began speaking publicly, first at local events, then at state forums. She talked about Emily, about her resilience, about how fear doesn't always look like bruises. "By the time it becomes obvious," Rachel told one audience, "it's often too late." The district attorney released the final case summary 6 months after the shooting. It concluded that no criminal charges would be pursued against any third parties. No negligence met the legal threshold. The system, while imperfect, had operated within its rules. That conclusion angered many. Online forums filled with debates. Some blamed the courts. Others blamed mental health access failures. A few focused on Daniel's employer, arguing that termination without adequate support had accelerated the collapse. Experts pushed back, cautioning against simplistic explanations. "There is no single cause," one criminologist wrote. There is only convergence. The house on Riverside Drive sold again, this time to a family from out of state. The new owners had been informed of the property's history, as required by law. They chose to move forward anyway, repainting the rooms, planting new flowers, trying to overwrite memory with routine. But memory doesn't fade evenly. Each anniversary brought renewed attention. Local papers ran reflective pieces. Candlelight vigils were held. Emily's name became associated with advocacy efforts, her story cited in training materials for social workers and family court mediators. For Noah, time moved differently. Grief arrived in waves, sometimes quiet, sometimes overwhelming. He learned to navigate questions about his parents, to answer with rehearsed phrases that kept people at a distance. He grew older, taller, more reserved. The drawings changed. Fewer houses, more abstract shapes. Doors still appeared, but sometimes they were open. In professional circles, the Harper case became a case study. Panels discussed it at conferences. Researchers referenced it in papers about familial violence and systemic intervention limits. It was dissected, analyzed, and categorized. Yet for those who lived through it, it was never academic. Rachel kept Emily's phone on her nightstand, unable to delete the last voicemail her sister had left, a mundane message about grocery shopping and schedules. Ordinary words preserved forever, a reminder of how quickly normalcy can vanish. As years passed, the sharpness of public attention dulled, replaced by newer tragedies. But the Harper story lingered in the background, a cautionary tale without a clean moral, a reminder that prevention requires more than awareness, more than policy, more than good intentions. It requires listening to what isn't being said. And even then, sometimes, it isn't enough. By the time the 5th anniversary arrived, the Harper case had settled into a strange dual existence. In public memory, it had become a reference point, a story summarized in a few lines whenever conversations turned to domestic violence or family court failures. In private, for those who had lived inside it, the story was still unfolding, changing shape as time stretched the distance between what had happened and what life demanded next. Noah was 12 when he asked Rachel a question she had been dreading without realizing it. They were driving home from school, rain tapping softly against the windshield, when he said, very calmly, "Do you think Dad was always going to do it, or do you think something made him decide that day?" Rachel pulled the car over. She had learned, through therapy sessions and long nights of research, that children who survive domestic homicide often search for causality as a way to reclaim control. If there was a moment, a trigger, then maybe it could be understood, avoided, undone. She told Noah the truth as gently as she could, that some people carry storms inside them for a long time. That stress, fear, and hopelessness can twist how someone sees the world. That nothing Noah or his mother did caused what happened. He listened quietly, absorbing the words without reacting. Later that night, Rachel heard him crying softly into his pillow, grief arriving not as confusion this time, but as something closer to anger. Across the state, reforms inspired in part by the Harper case began to take effect. Family courts implemented additional screening tools for high-conflict custody disputes. Judges received expanded training in identifying emotional coercion and psychological instability. Parole officers, social workers, and educators attended joint seminars focused on early intervention. None of these changes carried Emily Harper's name officially, but her influence was unmistakable. Lieutenant Rivera retired the following year. On his last day, he walked through the station, shaking hands, accepting quiet thanks. Before leaving, he paused at the evidence room, where boxes from closed cases were stacked neatly on shelves. Somewhere among them was the file labeled Harper, EMILY. He knew it would likely never be reopened, but he also knew it would never truly be closed. He often thought about the neighbor who had called 911, about the seconds that separated survival from loss. He thought about the moments where intervention might have mattered, even if the outcome remained uncertain. "We don't get to save everyone," he told a rookie officer once, "but we owe it to them to try harder the next time." Daniel Harper's name, by contrast, faded quickly. There were no memorials, no advocacy groups bearing his likeness. He became a footnote in reports, a subject of psychological analysis, a cautionary example. In some circles, his actions were framed as the ultimate act of selfishness. In others, as a tragic manifestation of untreated mental illness. For Noah, he remained something more complicated. A father who read bedtime stories, who taught him how to ride a bike, who also destroyed the world they shared. As Noah entered his teenage years, his grief shifted again. He grew quieter, more introspective. Teachers described him as intelligent but distant. He excelled in art and writing, often producing pieces that explored themes of absence and memory. One short story he submitted for a school competition told of a lighthouse keeper who extinguished the light because he believed no ship should sail without him. The judges praised its maturity without knowing how close it came to truth. Rachel worried constantly about the legacy of trauma. She ensured Noah remained in therapy, even when he insisted he was fine. She learned to read the signs of emotional withdrawal, to ask questions without prying, to sit in silence when words failed. On the 10th anniversary, the town of Larkin Falls held a small remembrance event, unadvertised and understated. A bench was installed in the park near Riverside Drive, engraved simply with Emily Harper's name and the dates of her life. There was no mention of how she died. Just a space to sit, to breathe, to remember. Noah attended, standing slightly apart from the crowd. He listened as a local advocate spoke about resilience, about the importance of noticing the quiet suffering that often precedes violence. When the speech ended, Noah approached the bench alone. He sat for a long time, tracing the engraved letters with his fingers. Later, when Rachel asked him how he felt, he said something that surprised her. "I don't want people to remember us only for how it ended." In that moment, something shifted. As Noah moved into adulthood, he began to speak publicly, cautiously at first, then with growing confidence. He talked about grief not as a singular event, but as a lifelong process. He spoke about loving someone who caused irreparable harm, and the shame that often accompanies that truth. He rejected simple narratives of monsters and victims, insisting instead on complexity without excusing violence. His words resonated. Universities invited him to speak. Advocacy organizations asked him to consult on survivor-centered programs. He studied psychology, drawn to the unanswered questions that had shaped his childhood. He wrote his thesis on intergenerational trauma and prevention frameworks, citing cases like his own, anonymized but unmistakable. The Harper story, once confined to police reports and news headlines, evolved into something else. It became a lens through which people examined their own relationships, their own assumptions about danger and despair. It prompted conversations that were uncomfortable but necessary. And still, the fundamental questions remained. Could this have been prevented? Was there a moment when a different choice might have changed everything? Or are some tragedies the result of forces too complex, too deeply rooted to untangle in time? There were no definitive answers, but there was movement. There was awareness. There were lives touched and altered in ways that rippled outward quietly, persistently. On Riverside Drive, the maple tree out front continued to grow, its branches stretching wider each year. Children played on the sidewalk. Dogs barked. Life went on, as it always does, carrying with it the echoes of what came before. And somewhere within those echoes was a reminder that stories like the Harper case are not just about violence or loss. They are about the spaces in between, where intervention might live, where compassion might interrupt despair, where listening could mean the difference between survival and silence. It is in those spaces that the future waits, uncertain, fragile, and still worth protecting. Thank you for joining me here at Mr. Midnight. True crime stories remind us of life's mysteries and the importance of staying aware even as we seek comfort in the quiet of the night. Let the rain carry you to a peaceful sleep. And until we meet again, stay safe, stay curious.